It's weight behind the decision of the World Trade Organization to waive intellectual property rights on vaccine production. The government says this bodes well for local COVID-19 vaccine manufacturers. South Africa and India first proposed measures to the WTO with the support of other developing countries during the height of COVID-19. Trade, Industry and Corporations Minister Ebrahim Patel says they are quite pleased about these developments. Kailihle Khumalo has more of that.
The pharmaceutical sector has been given a shot in the arm after the World Trade Organization had finally given in on the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights waiver on the manufacturing of COVID-19 vaccines.
We had to get used to
Trade, Industry and Competition Minister Ebrahim Patel says this is a very significant moment.
We now have an agreement that covers the right of developing countries to use the intellectual property for vaccines, for vaccine ingredients, for vaccine processes, for all the things that go into the making of a vaccine, and to do it without necessarily getting the permission of the patent holder.
The government says this will also scale up production on the continent, and further partnerships will be needed, including access to know-how and technologies.
We have found that there's a lot of warmth and openness by other African countries to source their vaccines from the limited African producers at the moment. We have an African vaccine initiative, AVAT, which is in fact prioritizing procuring from African suppliers.
Meanwhile, as the Russia-Ukraine conflict continues, Agriculture Minister Togo Didiza says South Africa does have a sufficient amount of food to cater for its citizens, but they're very concerned about steep food prices.
I would say at the moment, in terms of food security, we are okay as a country. The issues that we are concerned about is indeed the prices that have shot up, which puts strain on a number of people, particularly our communities. That's one of the challenges.
The TRIPS waiver will last for a period of 5 years, and South Africa says there will be a massive campaign to make sure that the COVID-19 vaccines are sourced in our shores. Kailihle Khumalo, SABC News, Kempton Park.
Deborah James is the Director of International Programs at the Center for Economic and Policy Research and coordinates the global Our World is Not for Sale network. She joins us now via Zoom in Frankfurt, Germany, to speak about her observations of the conference. A very good evening to you. Thanks for taking the time. So, is the text anything close to the original TRIPS waiver requested by South Africa and India, as South Africa says it's pleased with the developments?
It's a bit shocking because the deal that was agreed to this week in the World Trade Organization is actually quite similar to the deal proposed by the European Union, and actually does not resemble hardly at all the proposal by South Africa, India, 60 other co-sponsors that was supported by over 100 developing countries in the WTO that they have fought valiant for over the last year and a half. Major flaws indicate that it will be almost impossible to actually use. A couple of the basic ones are actually that it excludes treatments and tests, so it only applies to vaccines. It actually applies only to patents, so it excludes the other major areas of intellectual property, such as trade secrets. And it puts so many onerous hoops to jump through. Actually, the rich countries sabotaged it so much that they can pretend to be offering a concession, while actually it will be almost impossible for developing countries to use. And for example, at the very end of the negotiations, there was an agreement on a footnote that says, if you have existing capacity to manufacture vaccines, you're not actually supposed to use the agreement. So if you have the ability to manufacture, you're not supposed to use it. So it's a bit of a sham deal, and it's really depressing and I think disappointing for campaigners and really experts around the world who know access to medicines, who have been fighting for this for nearly 2 years, because we don't believe that it will actually save a single life from COVID. And it's really much more about saving the reputation of the Director General, particularly saving the reputation of the World Trade Organization, which is very disappointing.
And I just want to understand this in layman's terms. What you've just said now is quite fascinating, that if you have the capacity, then you shouldn't be manufacturing. But the whole thing here has been about the intellectual property, that we need to have details of the science behind the manufacturing of the vaccines themselves. I don't think the developing nations would have asked developed countries to do that if we had that within our arsenal. So this new deal, from what you're saying, it actually seems to offer very little from the exemptions already available to WTO members under the existing rules. So tell us about the few distinctions, including the simplifying of the notification requirements. What does it do in layman's terms? How have they been able to maneuver?
Well, there is one waiver on one provision of the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. But according to experts, this new deal is one of 5 ways that countries can have some flexibilities from the TRIPS agreement, and it's actually the hardest to use. And it's really important to take a step back and realize that 27 years ago, developed countries invented this concept of having an agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights in the WTO, because they had the advantage in innovation, okay? All developed countries, when they were in their stages of development, they took everybody else's copyright material. The United States' entire industrial development, if you study it, we took all industrial designs from Europe. We copied books left and right from Europe. We did not protect intellectual property. And only when we got an advantage in innovation, we said, oh, guess what? This intellectual property rules are really good for everyone. And so there was a very big PR campaign at the time of the founding of the WTO to convince developing countries that this was in their development interests. And it's actually never been. So the TRIPS agreement represents one of the biggest transfers of wealth from consumers to corporations, and particularly from the global south to the global north. Because in the global north, in the OECD countries, the rich countries, we used to have about $5 billion of revenues from intellectual property receipts. And now, after all these years after the implementation of this in the WTO, we have over $500 billion. Developing countries had negligible revenues from IP, and now they still don't even have $1 billion in revenue compared to $500 billion in the rich countries. So it's really quite a scam, and it's really a massive distortion of the global economy. So you can imagine this is the only aspect of trade where the World Trade Organization, that is supposedly about promoting free trade, right? So you promote more competition, you have less limits on trade, you increase competition, you drive down prices. Intellectual property is about the government intervening in the economy to protect monopolies, eliminate competition, increase scarcity, and drive up prices, okay, on all kinds of intellectual property. So it's really the biggest protectionist racket in the world. And we've just are living through a COVID-19 pandemic in which millions and millions of people have died. And the rich countries in particular, the US and EU, but also Switzerland and the United Kingdom played a very nefarious, harmful role in saying, oh, we don't see any problem with intellectual property. We think it's led to the invention of these things. Well, actually, millions of people have died, and that's the problem, because they didn't have access to vaccines. But now that vaccines are more widely available, we need access to treatments, and we need access to tests. If you can imagine a person in your community, and the community is dying, and you have the recipe to save the community, and you say, no, I don't want to share it with my community. Instead, I'm going to keep it for myself, and I'm going to sell it to the highest bidder. That's what the intellectual property rules in the WTO do. They protect billionaires' rights to become multi-billionaires instead of protecting the rights of people in developing countries to live. And this TRIPS non-waiver, the same thing happened across all of the issues this week at the WTO. because developing countries were also advocating for the right to be able to invest in domestic production to increase production in agriculture. And the rich countries said no. And so in each of the main 4 areas of the negotiations this week, developing countries came up short, and the rich countries got an expansion of the WTO.
So this is, I suppose, why the critics are saying it's a drastically reduced form of what was originally proposed. But some are saying the biggest change, and which was one of the most contentious points of the discussion at the ministerial conference, according to observers, was the limit of the New Deal imposed on eligibility. So what does it say? And explain to us this whole thing about eligibility as well.
Well, so this came down to an argument between the United States and China. And so the U.S. is a little bit anti-China crazed right now. And so the United States wanted to ensure that China was not able to use these new flexibilities. And so that's the negotiations that went, actually almost all of the rest of the negotiations were finished, and they went all night. Negotiating between the U.S. and China, and the U.K. somehow got itself in the room. And the United States wanted, in writing, the ability to ensure that China would not be able to use the flexibilities. And so what came out actually was this footnote that states that countries with capacity, existing capacity to manufacture vaccines, are encouraged not to avail themselves of the flexibilities. And so it's literally like you can only use the waiver to produce vaccines if you're not able to actually produce vaccines.
All right. Deborah, I'm afraid
so it's just a bit shocking.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Your time and your insights. Deborah James, Director of International Programs at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and coordinates the global Our World Is Not for Sale network. She's in Frankfurt in Germany. Let's take you back.